found after the assassination. Guess whose name is in it? George Lincoln Rockwell, president of the American Nazi Party. Now, most assassination researchers will tell you that, well, Oswald got out of the Soviet Union with some money and with the daughter of a Soviet GRU, military intelligence colonel, in tow as his wife. Virtually impossible to do in the Soviet Union at that day. So in other words, he's got intelligence running him. And most JFK assassination researchers point out the documents connecting him to the CIA and FBI and conclude, well, it's the CIA running him over there. But let's remember who the human on the ground intelligence is for the CIA in the Soviet Union at that time. It's General Galen. It's his outfit. So when you tie him with George de Mohrenschildt, who's introducing Oswald to the white Russian community in Dallas, he's also introducing Oswald. Guess what? George de Mohrenschildt's an oil geologist, guys. So he's introducing Oswald to the Murchisons and the Hunts, the big Texas oil men, who have their own reasons to hate Kennedy. And now the real cherry on this sundae is, if you look at the research of Professor Peter Dale Scott, who's done just an enormous amount of yeoman's work on the American deep state and its role in the Kennedy assassination, Professor Scott points out that the Texas oilmen appeared to have had some sort of private intelligence operation, some private intelligence network. Guess whose it was? It was General Galen.
Galen's.
Yeah. So the Texas oilmen have a direct intelligence pipeline to West German intelligence, which under Galen, like it or not, it's a Nazi intelligence organization. So in other words, if you bother to look, you've got all of these little indicators that, yeah, besides pissed off Cubans and pissed off American intelligence community, pissed off central bankers because Kennedy's bypassed the Federal Reserve, you also have a bunch of Nazis thrown into the mix, along with the mafia and everybody else. So yeah, this is a huge story, folks, and I know it sounds ridiculous and like a bad Hollywood B movie, but I can assure you, the dots are there to connect.
No doubt, no doubt. Now, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ian.
Now, the Bushes had a hand in
Germany. Say again, please.
Oh, no, the Bushes, they had a direct hand in funneling money through a German company directly to the Nazi Party, right?
Yes. Do I know anything about that? Yeah.
Yeah. Could you just elaborate on that?
Sure. Senator Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush's father. Prescott Bush, during World War II, headed a bank called the Union Bank and Trust Company. Franklin Roosevelt put it on the enemies list and closed it down because it was still conducting business with Nazi Germany after the American declaration of war and after the Nazi declaration of war on us. They were doing business with Nazi Germany for 6 months after the declaration. Well, anyway, the Union Bank and Trust had as a hidden partner one Fritz Thiesen. Okay, Fritz Thiesen was the big German steel magnate that headed Vereinigte Stahlwerke inside of Nazi Germany and was an early financier to Adolf Hitler when Hitler was running his political campaigns to be elected chancellor. Okay, so in other words, you've got Bush, Fritz Thiesen, Adolf Hitler as a chain of financial flow from the United States to Germany and to Hitler's campaign coffers. So yeah, you've got all of these things. And Thiesen, it's important to remember that Thiesen was later put into a concentration camp for a few months because he broke with Hitler. And I've always suspected, because if you look at Thiesen now, today, Thiesen is still a gigantic company. It merged with Krupp. So now you've got the German firm of Thiesen Krupp. They build elevators over here. You can see their little trucks driving around.
That name. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Fritz Thiesen, I think, may be one of these characters, just like the Madrid Circular suggested, that was put into prison for the express purpose of sanitizing their record in the post-war era. Well, look at me. I actually opposed the Nazis. I broke with the Nazis. I served time. Under Adolf Hitler. So yeah, it's a huge story, folks.
Okay, you're one of the few, if the only person that I'm aware of that ties together this. You call it a mafia-style covert war, basically between the Nazis, basically who are in the middle between the communist East and the American capitalist West.
Right.
And as I mentioned to you before in the beginning of the show, I'm holding in my hand some literature from Myron Fagan, and this goes back to the early 1920s. This piece was written in 1964, and if you don't mind, I would like to read a passage or two from here. First of all, this is chapter 2. It says, first of all, I wish to stress that this is not my first warning to the American people that Hollywood, radio, TV are the craftiest, most brazen, most poisonous, most dangerous carriers of communist propaganda of all our mass communications media. And further, on the following page here, and I'm just going to jump down in the middle of this paragraph, he says, I did not have the slightest suspicions that many of my close friends and colleagues and associates were as deep in the commission of treason as Alger Hiss, which is a name I recognize from your recent book. Now, this is the guy who was actually convicted. Is that correct? He was convicted as a communist?
Well, he was not convicted for espionage. He was actually convicted for perjury, for lying to the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was the committee that got Richard Nixon his start, because, of course, Richard Nixon brought in Whittaker Chambers, who had been claimed to have been a member of Hiss's communist cell, all right? And Hiss was convicted subsequently for perjury, for lying to that committee. There are still people in this country to this day that think he was innocent, but the problem is, with the declassification recently of the Venona transcripts, Hiss is clearly mentioned in there with a Soviet code name, all right? So Hiss was part of that very left-wing group of experts that Franklin Roosevelt brought into power when he assumed power in the United States, that were persistent throughout the Roosevelt administration. And there's so much going on here in the background that looks very suspicious when you look at it with alternative kind of conspiracy spectacles, because Roosevelt, of course, had Henry Wallace as vice president, who was dropped in his 1944 race and substituted by Harry Truman, you know, this Democrat senator from Missouri that was kind of a nobody, you know, KKK member and all of this stuff. So there's definitely this kind of lurch to the right in the last Roosevelt administration. But the thing here that interests me, that I mentioned in the third way, I spent a whole chapter on Senator Joseph McCarthy just to get people to think a bit and drop the propaganda that they've been spoon-fed, that, you know, this guy is some sort of diabolical Machiavellian evil genius monster. He's certainly a shameless opportunist. I mean, I think that's very clear, but nonetheless, you have the McCarthy Committee in the 1950s. But what interests me is there are all of these committees after World War II investigating some aspect of penetration of the American federal government. You know, McCarthy's the most famous or infamous. Right. You have the Kefauver Committee investigating the penetration of the mafia and its influence in the federal government. You've got the House Un-American Activities Committee. You've got the Reese Committee in the House investigating the American corporate foundations, Ford and Rockefeller, and their influence on American policy. You've got all of these committees, and no one has sat down to look at them whole. But there's one key ingredient that kind of connects these dots, okay? Most people don't know that the young Robert Kennedy was an assistant junior counsel on Senator McCarthy's committee. And he had been put there by his father, Joseph Kennedy, who was a close friend of Senator McCarthy. In fact, Joe Kennedy wanted Bobby Kennedy to be McCarthy's chief counsel, all right? And Robert Kennedy was a close friend of Senator McCarthy to such an extent
that he secretly attended
Senator McCarthy's funeral when McCarthy died. He secretly,
see, I did read your book.
Yeah, he secretly flew to Apple.
All right.